Labour. Well, the issue of anti-Semitism has long been a thorny one for the left. On today's Labour List, a weblog supportive of the Labour Party but independent of it, there's an opinion piece describing anti-Semitism inside Labour as a cancer which could destroy the party. Quite often, the disputes centre around language and semantics. I've been speaking to Hannah Weisfeld, director of British Jewish pro-Israel, pro-peace movement, Yachad. I asked her first if she thought Jeremy Corbyn had done enough by suspending both Naz Shah and Ken Livingstone.
I think it's a start. I think the real issue, though, is that there is a real lack of understanding in the public domain and obviously in the Labour Party about the distinctions between criticism of Israel, anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism. And I think until that's really dealt with publicly and properly, we're going to find these things coming up again and again and again. And I'm not sure sort of these explosions that happen in the media followed by suspension is really long-term a viable way to deal with any of it.
Well, let's then look at the comments that have been made that have led to both Naz Shah's suspension as well as Ken Livingstone's. And they're all to do with very specific comments. Let's start with Ken Livingstone's today. He was defending Naz Shah. He talks about Hitler winning the election in 1932, and his policy then was that Jews should be moved to Israel. He was supporting Zionism, is what Ken Livingstone says. Is this anti-Semitic?
Well, that is an incredibly revisionist understanding of history. Any support, if you can call it support, that Hitler had for moving Jews to Israel was to remove what he considered to be cancer in German society out of Germany. I'm not quite sure what Ken Livingstone thought he was going to achieve by bringing Hitler into the conversation, but you can read his comments in many different ways and none of them are particularly positive. So is it that Zionism is as bad as Hitler? Is it that, the Jews were colluding with Hitler to create the Holocaust so Israel could be created? Whichever way you read it, it really oversteps the mark. And once you bring Hitler and the Nazis into a conversation about modern-day anti-Semitism in Israel, I think that you have gone one step really much too far.
In the same comments that Ken Livingstone was making, he talked about Naz Shah's tweet, which was specifically in the context of the Israeli government's policy of bombing Gaza. It was the 2014 bombing of Gaza. And those comments were the following: the Jews are rallying to the poll at the bottom and there is now 87% disagreeing and 13% agreeing with the following. It was a John Prescott poll. I agree with John Prescott that Israel is committing war crimes. So she retweeted that. Is that anti-Semitic?
It's not anti-Semitic to be a critic of Israel. And actually the organisation that I work for, Yachad, was set up to give Jews a voice who could say that we're supporters of Israel and we're concerned by the policies of the Israeli government. The problem with all of this is that when you overstep the mark from being a critic, and you can be as critical as you like of the Israeli government, a critic of Israel, and you move into the idea that somehow Jews en masse are responsible for the actions of another government or that their behaviour is wrong or exceptional, you are basically blaming an ethnic minority or a religious minority for something that you don't agree with. And that is when you start overstepping the mark. If Naz Shah had said, I don't support the actions of the Israeli government and I think what they're doing is wrong, and she can think they're committing war crimes and go out and vote against this poll, that's a totally different statement. And people might not like it, but she's entitled to say it.
And the very last thing that she is accused of being anti-Semitic is the Facebook posting that she shared. And the post talks about a solution for the Israel-Palestine conflict. And what it talks about is relocating Israel into the United States. And in that post, there is talk of the transportation costs of moving Israel to the United States. Is that anti-Semitic?
I think that Naz Shah said a lot of things which are anti-Semitic. I'm not sure she is an anti-Semite, and I think there's quite a big difference. When you talk about transportation of Jews from the single biggest population of Jews in the world is inside Israel, it is very difficult to not draw parallels to the last time that there was mass transportation of Jews, which was in the Second World War and in the Holocaust. And I think that she has issued a very unreserved, full apology. And I think that actually, in the case of Naz Shah, the Jewish community particularly should say, yes, we were offended by your comments, and yes, we're pleased that you have apologised, and we want to take you up on your offer of engagement and explain to you why what you have said is misinformed and offensive. And I think it would be a terrible mistake if the way that this argument and debate plays out in the public domain is by shutting down, debate, by closing doors on people, because actually what we need to do is publicly go out and have these conversations and actually get people to understand when the lines are being crossed.
And in the case of Ken Livingstone, you think that he is anti-Semitic?
Ken has a history of making really quite offensive statements about the Jewish community and about Jews that range from things like calling a Jewish reporter a concentration camp guard because he didn't like that he was being hounded by him, to making comments about the fact that the Jewish community would never vote for him because they're too wealthy, and things that are real old school anti-Semitic tropes. And he's very, very defensive and not apologetic about them. And I think that what he said this morning shows such a lack of willingness to engage and actually to understand why he is really deeply offending people that it's very hard not to come out of that and think that he is anti-Semitic.
You don't accept his defence that he has fought his entire political life on an anti-racist platform, on anti-prejudice platform?
One of the things that for me is very frustrating about this whole debate is the number of people who have said exactly that, which is, how dare you accuse me? I'm left-wing, I'm anti-racist, I'm anti-this, I'm anti-fascist. So of course I'm not an anti-Semite, as if somehow they are exonerated from, everything because of how they choose to define themselves. And actually, the fact that Ken went on, national television today and said that this entire thing is basically an attempt by people who don't want there to be any criticism of Israel to shut down debate, I think really proves that he's just not interested at all in understanding where legitimate criticism and debate becomes unacceptable and actually anti-Semitic. There are examples where people do use the anti-Semitism card to shut down debate or shut down disagreement, or people being critical of Israel in the way that others don't like. But this is different, and this is different because actually what you're seeing is people in relatively significant positions in a political party who are unable to actually work out when they themselves have overstepped the mark.
That was Hannah Weisfeld, director of British Jewish pro-Israel, pro-peace movement Yakad. And we did ask Ken Livingstone for a response to the criticisms in this interview, but he declined.